me and them hoes do not like that. They think I'm Jordan, mother, how I'm coming on that my check. Don't check for me if ain't no check for me, and I know not check. Fuck a snack, cause I'm the recipe, I'm really like that. I be Audi in my Audi, while you out here catching bodies. Bitches bank accounts on E, I be like, whoa, keep it savvy. These hoes couldn't stop me, even on my worst day. I keep that cake up in my pockets every day, my birthday. I put my neck on chill, put my wrist on freeze, put the deuces on the whip, and you know I keep them clean. I just came back on the scene like I never took a break. Bitches think I'm selling pussy, niggas think I'm pushing weight.
In the heart of Indianapolis, a mother's dark secret lay hidden behind closed doors until it was too late. 2-year-old Skylar Gardner was found lifeless beneath a fallen dresser in an apartment described by investigators as a biohazard. Frostbitten, bruised, and covered in filth, her tiny body told a story of unimaginable suffering. But the most chilling part, she had been left alone, neglected for days, while her mother, Chantell Gardner, spent nights at her boyfriend's house. As police pieced together the truth, they uncovered a horrifying pattern of abandonment that would shock even the most seasoned detectives. Skylar Gardner was just 2 years old, too young to understand why her mother kept leaving, too small to fight against the bitter cold that would ultimately claim her life. Her 3-year-old brother, equally neglected, was left to fend for himself in an apartment filled with rotting food, human waste, and unbearable filth. Their mother, 33-year-old Chantell Gardner, was an aspiring rapper and social media influencer known for posting music videos and engaging online. But while she portrayed a glamorous life to her followers, her children were trapped in horrifying conditions, abandoned, starving, and helpless. Their suffering went unnoticed until it was too late. On the night of January 25, 2025, Chantell returned to her apartment after spending the night at her boyfriend's place. She called out for her children, but only her son came running. When she searched the filthy apartment, she found Skylar lying cold and unresponsive beneath a lightweight dresser. Paramedics arrived, but it was already too late. Investigators soon discovered that Skylar had not only suffered from hypothermia, but also had bruises, bite marks, and a puncture wound on her neck. The question remained, was this a tragic accident caused by neglect, or was something far more sinister at play? As authorities dug deeper, a disturbing truth emerged. Chantell had been leaving her children alone for hours, sometimes days, while she enjoyed the comforts of her boyfriend's home. The apartment had no heat, no proper food, and no care. Skylar's tragic death wasn't just a result of neglect, it was the culmination of repeated abandonment. Could this have been prevented? And how did a mother prioritize her own desires over the well-being of her children? Welcome to Shocking Crime Cases. Subscribe and hit the bell icon for more real-life crime stories that educate, inform, and uncover the darkest truths. To the outside world, 33-year-old Chantell Gardner appeared to be an ambitious woman chasing a dream. She was an aspiring rapper, social media content creator, and self-proclaimed influencer. Online, she presented herself as confident and stylish, frequently posting videos of herself rapping, dancing, and engaging with followers. She built an image of success, seeking collaborations and networking with other artists. But behind the filtered images and upbeat videos, Chantell's real life told a different story. She was unemployed and struggling financially, bouncing between temporary jobs while relying on social media engagement to sustain her lifestyle. Despite her financial troubles, she frequently spent money on nights out, gambling, and sports betting. She often stayed with her boyfriend, Brian Thomas, spending days at his apartment, while leaving her children unattended. Those who knew her personally described her as outgoing but irresponsible. Friends recalled that she frequently talked about her rap career and her social media presence, but rarely mentioned her children. Some claimed she expressed frustration about motherhood, complaining that it limited her ability to enjoy life. A close friend later admitted that Chantell had confided in her about feeling overwhelmed by the responsibility of raising 2 children alone. Chantell had full custody of her children, as their father lived in Ohio and struggled with a disability. While he tried to maintain contact, he later revealed that Chantell often ignored his calls or made excuses to keep the children from speaking with him. Meanwhile, her social media activity remained constant, portraying a carefree, glamorous lifestyle, while her 2 young children were left behind in squalor. Skylar Gardner, just 2 years old, was a bright-eyed toddler who depended entirely on her mother for love, care, and protection. Her 3-year-old brother, equally vulnerable, looked up to Chantell as his only guardian. But instead of nurturing her children, Chantell saw them as burdens, obstacles standing in the way of her personal life. Neighbors rarely saw the children outside, and when they did, they appeared unkempt and withdrawn. Family members who tried to check on them were often met with excuses or ignored calls. As time passed, the neglect worsened, setting the stage for the unthinkable tragedy to come. There were warning signs, subtle yet alarming. Chantell's social media posts painted a troubling picture. In one chilling Facebook status, she wrote, "I don't trust nobody but my kids. And my second-born is a little iffy." At the time, it seemed like a passing remark, but in hindsight, it hinted at a disturbing lack of attachment. Friends noticed her growing absence from home. She stopped bringing her children around, dodged questions about them, and even avoided her own apartment because of its unbearable stench. The people around her suspected something was wrong, but no one realized just how dire the situation had become. In October 2024, Chantell Gardner's pattern of neglect escalated. What started as brief absences, stepping outside to meet her boyfriend in the parking lot, soon became entire nights away. At first, she would run quick errands, leaving Skylar and her brother alone for short periods. But as time passed, those absences stretched into full days. By December, Chantell was barely coming home. She spent up to 5 nights a week at Brian Thomas's apartment, sometimes not checking on her children for over 24 hours. When she did return, it was only to drop off fast food, cheeseburgers, chicken nuggets, chips, and sports drinks. Bathing them became infrequent. Cleaning the apartment was no longer a priority. Skylar and her brother were left to fend for themselves in filth. The apartment had no functioning heat, with indoor temperatures dropping to as low as 46 degrees Fahrenheit. Trash, human waste, and rotting food piled up around them. The children wore dirty clothes, slept on soiled bedding, and suffered in silence. Then, on January 24, 2025, Chantell left her children alone again. She stopped by in the afternoon, briefly giving them McDonald's before heading back to Brian's place. She didn't return until the next evening, January 25th. When she walked in, the apartment was eerily quiet. She called out for her children. Her son appeared, but Skylar did not. That's when she found her daughter lying cold and unresponsive beneath a lightweight dresser. Instead of immediately calling 911, Chantell panicked. She carried Skylar outside and frantically called Brian before finally dialing emergency services. But it was too late. Skylar was already gone. Chantell's own words revealed her detachment from her children. She openly admitted that caring for them was overwhelming and that she had strayed away from home because of the unbearable smell. Her neglect wasn't just physical, it was psychological. She stopped taking the children to doctor's appointments, fearing that medical staff would report their condition to Child Protective Services. Instead of addressing their hygiene, she avoided them, letting weeks pass without bathing them. She even admitted that Skylar's skin had developed sores from prolonged exposure to filth. Inside the apartment, danger lurked at every corner. The floors were littered with broken furniture, trash, and open food containers. Fesses were smeared on the walls and furniture, and knives lay scattered within reach of the toddlers. The cold, unheated space turned deadly during the winter, yet Chantell never sought help, never asked a friend or relative to care for her kids. Each decision she made pushed Skylar closer to tragedy. Each night she spent with Brian instead of her children sealed her fate. And when Skylar's cries finally fell silent, it was too late to undo the damage. There were people who suspected something was wrong, but no one acted in time. Chantell's close friends noticed she rarely spoke about her children. When asked about them, she brushed off concerns with vague responses or changed the subject. One friend later admitted that Chantell told her the kids were with Brian whenever she went out, though Brian later denied this. Neighbors occasionally heard muffled cries coming from the apartment but assumed the children were just being unruly. Some noticed the overwhelming stench seeping into the hallway but never reported it. Skylar's father, living in Ohio, grew suspicious when Chantell repeatedly ignored his calls. He had been trying to maintain contact with his kids, but each time he asked to see them, she made excuses. His older children, who had visited Skylar and her brother months earlier, recalled that the toddlers smelled of urine and looked uncared for. Even Chantell's own admissions were red flags. She openly stated that she avoided taking the children to the doctor because she feared they would be taken away. She knew the danger she was putting them in, but instead of asking for help, she chose to hide their suffering. By the time anyone realized the truth, Skylar was already gone. At 6:30 p.m. on January 25, 2025, Chantell Gardner dialed 911 in a frantic voice, claiming she had found her 2-year-old daughter, Skylar, unresponsive under a dresser. When emergency responders arrived, they were met by Chantell outside the apartment complex. She was visibly distressed, pacing back and forth, crying and repeatedly saying, "She's not breathing." Officers followed Chantell inside, stepping into what they would later describe as a scene of absolute horror. The overwhelming stench of human waste and rotting food hit them immediately. Trash, discarded fast food containers, and dirty clothes covered the floors. The walls were smeared with feces. The air was thick with neglect, an unbearable combination of filth, decay, and something far worse, the presence of death. As paramedics reached Skylar's small body, it was clear she had been dead for hours. Her tiny frame was cold and stiff, her skin pale with bluish discoloration. Rigor mortis had already set in. A lightweight fabric dresser lay on its side nearby, but it was apparent that it wasn't heavy enough to have caused any fatal injuries. One officer took a deep breath and turned to Chantell. "How long has she been like this?" he asked. Her answer would only deepen the mystery surrounding Skylar's tragic fate. The apartment was a nightmare of filth and decay, what investigators later described as a biohazard. The living room and kitchen were unrecognizable beneath piles of trash, discarded food, and broken furniture. Chicken bones, fast food wrappers, and half-empty BQ sauce containers were strewn across the floor. A thick layer of grime coated the countertops. The children's sleeping area was no better. Their mattress was soaked in urine and smeared with feces, the walls covered in unknown substances. A baby crib sat in the corner, but it hadn't been used in months. It was crusted over with filth, its sheets stiff with dried stains. Skylar's 3-year-old brother stood nearby, his face blank, his body frail. He showed visible signs of neglect, his skin dirty, his clothes stiff with filth. He clung to a half-eaten piece of bread, his malnourished frame shaking as he ate in hurried, desperate bites. Skylar's body told its own story of suffering. Paramedics noted multiple bruises covering her arms, legs, and torso. Her hands and feet showed clear signs of frostbite. A small puncture wound was found on her neck, raising immediate questions. Bite marks, possibly human, were found on arms and back. The chilling realization set in. Skylar had endured prolonged suffering before she died. As investigators surveyed the apartment, one officer muttered, "This is worse than anything I've ever seen." The stench was so overwhelming that officers had to cover their noses. Detective Marcus Ellis, one of the first responders, later stated the conditions inside that home were beyond neglect. It was inhumane. That little girl never had a chance. The Marion County Coroner's Office conducted an immediate preliminary examination at the scene. A forensic investigator noted, Skylar's body was stiff and cold. Based on the level of rigor mortis, she had been deceased for several hours before the 911 call was made. Skylar's father, who had driven from Ohio after receiving the tragic news, was devastated. Speaking to detectives, he broke down in tears. "I begged to see my kids. I begged Chantell to let me talk to them. Now, my baby is gone." One of Chantell's friends, when questioned by police, expressed shock. "I had no idea she was leaving them alone like that. She always said the kids were with family or Brian. If I knew, I would have done something." Despite the overwhelming evidence of neglect, Chantell initially insisted she never meant to hurt her children. But as investigators pressed her for details, her story began to change. The Marion County Coroner's Office later determined that Skylar Gardner's official cause of death was hypothermia. The apartment, which had no working heat, had indoor temperatures recorded between 46 degrees Fahrenheit and 51 degrees Fahrenheit. Skylar's small body, unable to regulate heat effectively, slowly shut down as she lay freezing on the urine-soaked floor. However, hypothermia wasn't the only factor. Skylar's autopsy revealed multiple injuries, some inflicted before her death. She had bruises covering most of her body, including her face, arms, and legs, bite marks on her back and left arm, a puncture wound on her neck, suspected to be caused post-mortem possibly by a rodent. Signs of prolonged malnutrition and dehydration. Skylar's stomach contents were equally disturbing. Medical examiners found hair, small paint chips, and possibly feces in her intestines, suggesting she had been eating non-food items out of desperation. Despite these horrific findings, Chantell denied ever abusing Skylar, claiming she was simply overwhelmed and made mistakes. But, as authorities pieced together her actions, it became clear that Skylar's death was the result of months of severe neglect, not just a single bad decision. Detectives wasted no time in gathering evidence. Every detail mattered. Every inconsistency would help them uncover the truth. Phone records. Investigators pulled Chantell Gardner's phone logs and text messages. In the 48 hours leading up to Skylar's death, she barely contacted anyone about her children. Instead, her messages focused on casual conversations, talking about music, gambling, and making plans with her boyfriend, Brian Thomas. Nowhere did she mention checking on her kids. Autopsy report. The medical examiner confirmed a disturbing fact. Skylar had been dead for at least 6 hours before Chantell called 911. That meant Chantell found her daughter and delayed reporting it. She had time to process what happened. She had time to think, but she did not act. Surveillance footage. Cameras from the apartment complex showed something even more damning. For more than 24 hours before the emergency call, there was no recorded movement from Chantell's unit. No signs of her checking in, no signs of her bringing food. Brian Thomas's alibi. Chantell's boyfriend, Brian, claimed he had no idea she was leaving the kids alone. But when investigators pressed him, his answers changed. He hesitated. He backtracked. He lied. The evidence was piling up. Now it was time for Chantell to explain herself. When detectives first sat down with Chantell Gardner, she was calm, even detached. "I don't know what happened," she said. "I just found her like that." At first, she insisted that Skylar's death was an accident. She claimed she had only left the children alone for a few hours. She said she brought them food every day and made sure they were safe. But the evidence told a different story. When detectives confronted her with the autopsy report, her demeanor changed. They told her Skylar had been dead for hours before the 911 call. That meant Chantell had waited before seeking help. She hesitated. Then she changed her story. She admitted she had been staying at Brian's house overnight, but claimed she thought the kids were fine. Detectives pressed harder. They showed her the surveillance footage. They showed her the filthy, freezing apartment. They showed her pictures of Skylar's bruised, frostbitten body. Finally, she lowered her head. "I made mistakes," she whispered. "I didn't mean for this to happen." But was it really a mistake, or was it a pattern of deliberate neglect that ended in tragedy? With Chantell's confession in hand, investigators turned their focus to Brian Thomas, her boyfriend. At first, Brian denied any involvement. "I didn't even know she left them alone," he claimed. "She told me they were with family." But detectives weren't convinced. They had his phone records, text messages, and statements from witnesses. The truth started to unravel. Brian admitted that Chantell spent almost every night at his apartment. He also admitted that she never brought the children with her. But instead of questioning where they were, he chose to ignore it. When detectives asked why he never once asked about the kids, his answer was simple. "I didn't think it was my business." Brian had helped cover up Chantell's lies without realizing how deep the neglect had gone. By the time he found out the truth, it was too late. Investigators charged Brian Thomas with assisting a criminal. While he wasn't directly responsible for Skylar's death, he helped Chantell conceal the reality of her neglect. As both suspects sat in separate holding cells, one question remained. Would Chantell finally take full responsibility, or would she continue to shift the blame? The news of Skylar Gardner's tragic death spread quickly, sending shockwaves through the community. Local and national media covered the horrifying details of the case, painting a picture of a child left to suffer in silence while her mother pursued her own interests. News headlines were relentless. Mother charged with murder after toddler dies in biohazard apartment. 2-year-old found frozen to death while mother stayed with boyfriend. Neglect or murder. prosecutors seek justice for Skylar Gardner. Social media erupted in outrage. Thousands of users flooded comment sections expressing anger, heartbreak, and disbelief. One Twitter user wrote, "She had time to gamble and chase a man, but not to care for her own children. Disgusting." Another commented, "How do you ignore your kids until one of them dies? This wasn't a mistake. This was cruelty." A viral Facebook post read, "Skylar Gardner didn't have a voice. She didn't have a choice. We failed her." The public demanded answers. How had this been allowed to happen? As details of the case unfolded, those closest to Skylar struggled to process the horror of what had happened. Skylar's father, devastated and furious, spoke out. "I begged to see my kids. I called. I texted. I tried. But Chantell wouldn't let me. Now my baby is gone, and I have to live with that." A neighbor from the apartment complex recalled hearing faint cries at night, but never realizing how serious the situation was. "I just thought they were fussy kids. I had no idea they were in there alone. If I knew, I would have done something." One of Chantell's former friends came forward claiming she had suspicions but never confronted Chantell directly. "She always said the kids were with Brian or staying with family. I didn't push because I didn't think it was my place. Now I regret it every single day." On social media, users called for stricter child welfare policies and harsher punishments for neglect. One Facebook post read, "We don't just need justice for Skylar. We need to make sure this never happens again." As the case gained national attention, many began asking a painful question: could Skylar's death have been prevented? It soon became clear that warning signs had been missed or ignored. Chantell had stopped taking her children to doctor's appointments. Medical professionals later admitted that if she had brought them in, the signs of neglect would have been obvious. Family members had tried to check on the kids, but Chantell avoided them. Skylar's father said he begged to see them, but his calls went unanswered. Neighbors noticed the smell and strange noises from the apartment. Some even admitted they heard the children crying at odd hours, but didn't think it was serious enough to report. Friends suspected something was wrong. A former friend of Chantell later told reporters, "I knew she wasn't a great mom, but I never thought it was this bad. Looking back, I should have asked more questions." The heartbreaking reality. Many people saw glimpses of the neglect, but no one acted until it was too late. The Marion County Prosecutor's Office initially charged Gardner with neglect of a dependent resulting in death, a Level 1 felony carrying a maximum sentence of 40 years in prison. However, as evidence mounted and the full extent of Skylar's suffering came to light, prosecutors upgraded the charges to include murder. Gardner's initial hearing took place on a Thursday morning, with a jury trial scheduled for April 8. She remains in Marion County Jail without bond, facing the possibility of life imprisonment if convicted of murder. Brian Thomas faces 2 counts of assisting a criminal. His charges stem not from direct involvement in Skylar's death, but from his attempts to mislead investigators and protect Gardner. A warrant was issued for his arrest following the indictment. At Riley Children's Health, doctors discovered the horrifying impact of neglect on Skylar's 3-year-old brother. The medical evaluation revealed a child in crisis, severely constipated, weak, and exhibiting alarming twitchy, shaky movements. Doctors noted his condition would likely have become life-threatening had Skylar's death not led to his rescue. Most telling were his eating behaviors, which painted a picture of severe food deprivation. The toddler would become territorial over his food tray, experiencing complete meltdowns if anyone attempted to remove it. Staff observed him frantically consuming food in huge clumps, requiring intervention to prevent choking. According to the nurse practitioner's report, he showed significant emotional and cognitive issues, demonstrating how prolonged neglect had affected not just his physical health, but his psychological development as well. Skylar Gardner's story is more than just a tragic crime. It is a harsh reminder of what happens when neglect goes unchecked. Her death wasn't an isolated incident. It was the result of prolonged suffering, abandonment, and a system that failed to protect her. This case teaches us an important lesson: neglect is just as deadly as physical abuse. Skylar wasn't beaten to death, she was left to freeze, starve, and suffer alone. And yet, the warning signs were there all along. Family members had concerns, neighbors noticed odd behaviors, and friends sensed something was wrong. But no one acted fast enough. We often assume that someone else will step in, that someone else will make the call. But in reality, silence enables abuse. If you ever suspect that a child is in danger, speak up. A single phone call to Child Protective Services, the police, or even a community outreach program could be the difference between life and death. Skylar's life cannot be brought back, but her story can serve as a wake-up call for all of us. Child neglect is often overlooked because it doesn't always leave visible scars. But the consequences can be just as devastating. No child should suffer in silence. It is up to all of us, family members, neighbors, teachers, and even strangers, to recognize the signs and take action. If you see a child who appears malnourished, unkempt, or constantly left alone, don't ignore it. Contact Child Protective Services or local authorities. It's better to be wrong than to be too late. Skylar's case is heartbreaking, but it should serve as a call to action, to protect the innocent before tragedy strikes again. Skylar Gardner was just 2 years old. She had no voice, no choice, and no way to escape the nightmare she lived in. She depended on the one person who was supposed to protect her, and that person failed her. But the truth is, Skylar didn't just fall through the cracks of one neglectful mother. She fell through the cracks of a system, a community, and a world that too often ignores the signs of child endangerment. Her story is painful, but it should not be forgotten. Because if we remember, if we act, we may save the next child before it's too late. As we conclude Skylar's story, remember that change starts with awareness. If this video moved you, please take 3 crucial actions. First, hit that subscribe button to help us continue exposing cases that demand attention. Second, share this video with your community. You never know who might need to hear this warning. Finally, save the National Child Abuse Hotline number 180-042-244-53. Your vigilance could save a child's life. Don't assume someone else will speak up. As Skylar's case tragically proves, silence can be deadly. Skylar Gardner was just 2 years old, a bright-eyed toddler who should have had a lifetime ahead of her. Instead, she spent her final days in a freezing apartment, hungry, cold, and alone, except for her equally helpless brother. While her mother curated a perfect social media presence, Skylar fought for survival in unimaginable conditions. She never got to experience the simple joys of childhood, warm hugs, bedtime stories, or feeling safe in her own home. Today, she serves as a tragic reminder that behind closed doors and carefully crafted online personas, children like her still suffer in silence.